Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and I'd like to welcome you to another in our series of Conservationists in Action. And boy, does today's guest actually live up to that title for once. We're very fortunate this afternoon to have Bruce Beehle out here. Bruce is an ornithologist, a conservationist, and a naturalist. He's currently a research associate in the Division of Birds at the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian Institution. He's had quite a career after conducting doctoral field work in Papua New Guinea. He worked for 10 years for the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, followed by just about every NGO I can think of. He's worked with the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Department of State, the Counterpart International, Conservation International, and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. He's also published 11 books, and we're going to talk about his most recent one. Scores of technical and popular articles about birds and nature, and in 2007 he was featured in a 60 Minutes piece highlighting an expedition he led to the mountains of New Guinea, in which scores of new species of plants and animals were discovered. Fascinating stuff. Today we're going to talk with Bruce about his most recent book, which is called North on the Wing, Travels with the Songbird Migration of Spring. It's a wonderful book. I had the pleasure of reading it over this weekend. He's out here to give a public lecture, and luckily we were able to lure him to our studio for a quick distance broadcast. So Bruce, thanks so much for coming here.
Mark, thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Now, I could not do justice to your varied career before this book, but tell us a little bit about your training and the type of work you did
Sure.
in Papua New Guinea.
You know, I'm one of those lucky people who fell in love with birds early. I was 7 years old when I saw my first red-bellied woodpecker. Mm-hmm. And that was an epiphany. Seeing that bird really just opened my eyes to the natural world. And you know, having birds as a lodestar, something to follow was really quite something. And of course, at that time, this is in the late 1950s, loving birds is a perfectly nice hobby, but doesn't necessarily lead to a profession. And nobody, including myself, really thought I would become an ornithologist. But somehow, in sinuous ways, I was able to patch together some knowledge and some experience that eventually led to going to graduate school. And before I went to graduate school, I won a travel fellowship called a Watson Fellowship. Mm-hmm. Sure. And that was this real turning point that allowed me to become a scientist and an ornithologist. And that allowed me to spend a little more than a year on my own in New Guinea trying to find out if this is what I really want to do for my life, study birds and study nature. And it worked out.
Indeed it did.
New Guinea is an interesting test bed to test your theories about
jumping in the deep end.
Right.
Ornithology.
I was obviously very lucky. There was a field station in New Guinea, and there were people there that were able to sort of guide me along. And from that springboard, from New Guinea, I was able to sell a bill of goods to a graduate school who somehow were convinced that I was a qualified biologist. They let me come to graduate school, and I actually got a PhD, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Well, a lot of your previous work has been on birds of New Guinea and so on. This book seems like a bit of a departure. How did you come to tackle this project?
So if we go back to 2012, I was with a graduate student in New Guinea. We were on the side of a mountain doing an elevational transect of bird distribution. And this was our third year in the field doing this. And I had another epiphany. I said, I'm going home. My desire at that point was, I'd been to New Guinea on 70 different trips, 70. Wow. It's a lot. That's obviously more than one a year.
Yeah.
Some of those trips are brief for conservation meetings and symposia, things like that. Others were as long as a year and a half. But at that point on the side of that mountain in 2012, something was telling me it was time to not trust fate anymore and to head home. And I really felt a tugging, and I felt I can hand this project off to a series of graduate students. They could take it over, and I could come back and start working on my true love, my original love, which is natural history of North America. And this book is sort of my first tentative step back in that direction. And I should say I am retired now, and that's
you
why I
wouldn't
can
know it
do.
from your production, though.
Well,
you're writing books and very active.
you know, it's the retirement I wanted to have. My whole life, I dreamed of writing nature books. I was inspired by them as a child, and I thought this would be a wonderful way to finish things up.
It certainly was. It actually is a beautiful natural history. A word,
Thank you.
A
You're
word
very
we don't
kind.
use as much today.
No. No.
It was interesting. This is a book written by a naturalist, somebody who really enjoys that. And we were interviewing George Schaller recently.
Another fabulous
Yeah, and
naturalist.
like you, he's had
And
a
a
varied
mentor of
career.
mine.
Yeah, and he's had a varied career working with primates, snow
everything.
leopards.
He did so much.
And we asked him, well, what would you call yourself? Conservation biologist, kind of a new term, field biologist. He's been described all sorts of different ways.
Sure.
And he said, just a naturalist. it's a simple term. It's an encompassing
Well, you know,
term.
there's that wonderful book by E.O. Wilson called
yes.
Naturalist, which is his autobiography. And that's a wonderful book, too. And I think it really does capture the fact that there's some great biologists out there, and I'm not including myself in that list.
I would.
Are true, wonderful naturalists who love nature.
Now, this book obviously demonstrated an interest in migration.
Yes.
And it raises a question. Do the birds that you were studying in New Guinea, are they migratory birds primarily, or are they endemic?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, you know, New Guinea is a big tropical island. It
Yeah.
sits right on the equator. And most of the birds don't migrate. There is some within island movement of birds that some of that may be a migration. And then you get a pretty substantial migration between Australia and New Guinea. So there are a number of birds that nest and breed in Australia and then spend the winter in New Guinea.
Okay.
There may be a few species that do that in New Guinea and winter in Australia, but not nearly as many. So they cross salt water.
Yeah.
And in fact, I was just hearing from some friends who were out on a boat between New Guinea and Australia, and these little kingfishers, these sacred kingfishers, which is probably the most famous trans-water migrant between Australia and New Guinea. They were out in a sailboat between those two subcontinents, and these little kingfishers kept coming by during the day, landing in the boat, resting, and then heading on.
Oh, it's great. It's a ferry.
And they were then, of course, they took an iPhone or a smartphone picture, and they sent them to me and said, "What are these darn these birds?"
Yeah, that's great.
So migration does occur there, and you know, most continents do have migration.
What was the pull to study this migration?
What was what?
What was the pull to study the migration you
Well,
covered
you know,
in the-
the real motivation of this book is Edwin Waiteel's North with the Spring, which is a Pulitzer Prize-winning book that he published in 1951 about a trip that he and his wife took in 1947. And that trip took them from South Florida up the Appalachians to northern New England, to the summit of Mount Washington. And essentially what I've done with this book is basically steal his book and redo it 60 years later and tweak it a bit. Yeah. So, you know, I loved his book. My mother read bits of that book to me when I was a child at night to put me to sleep. And to inspire
Yours
me.
would never do that. It was very stimulating.
I never forgot that book. And, you know, I always thought it was a brilliant idea. And when came time for retirement, I said, this is something that would bear doing again.
I can see from your description what's the same about your book and Teal's, following the migration along a flyway. What's different about your book?
Teal was not a biologist. He was a businessman who retired to nature, and God bless him for that. And I'm a biologist who retired to nature. And so I felt a bit of an obligation to my audience, if there is one, to really tell three stories. One is a fabulous trip out in nature, which is just fun, and it basically encourages everyone to do that.
Yeah.
If you get a chance. Two, to tell some research story, and that's the songbird migration. I wanted to tell a scientific story, thread that in, sort of hide that within the story of a trip. And then also I wanted to tell the story of the people who are out there every day doing nature study, doing research on bird migration, as well as doing the nature conservation that's necessary to protect the migration phenomenon. Because tends to be an upbeat book, but I can't hide the fact that songbirds, these migrant songbirds that go back and forth between the tropics and North America, they have declined substantially over the last 50 years since teal was out there. And so we really do need an advanced force out there in the field protecting these habitats and protecting the birds from a number of threats that are out there.
You have a few slides, and
I
this
do.
is, you paint a beautiful picture with prose, but it's also nice to see some pictures. Maybe
Well,
you could
let's look
show
at
us a
some.
little about
Sure.
this
If I
journey
can make
you
this
took.
work, let's see what we have here. Now, am I going to hit that?
There
Nope.
you go.
So, you start at the beginning. There I am in 1958.
You haven't changed a bit.
No, thank God. Lost a little bit of hair, perhaps. But there's one of my, I guess, Christmas presents. I think it's a Roy Rogers outfit, but I would have preferred a nice SLR camera with a long lens. I don't think they existed back then. But this is what I got instead. At that time, I was in love with woodpeckers and carried around Bent's Life Histories of North American Woodpeckers until the library people took it away from me and wouldn't share it. North of the Spring, that's the book that my mom read to me and is a book I still recommend to people. And the scientific story that I want to tell is one related to these migratory pathways that you see here in color. And the one I focused on is the one that goes from the Yucatan north across the Gulf of Mexico and right up the Mississippi, right up through the heartland of the US into Canada. And that's really, for songbirds, is really the most fantastic and most fulsome, the most sexy migration pathway for those birds. And you may, your listeners maybe know what songbirds are. Warblers, vireos, thrushes, orioles. There are lots of songbirds out there. They're the ones that sing so wonderfully, and a lot of them are really fantastic migrants. So, the trip was 100 days, camped in a tent, entertained myself by walking, hiking, following trails, paddling in a kayak, and spending a lot of time on a bike. A bike is a great way to get around in the backwoods, if they're, at least they're pathways, to chase down nature and wildlife. So,
Is this the way teal traveled?
This is, of course, not the way teal travel. He used the modified American plan, I think, which is stayed in motels. You know, he got on the back roads too, but he was a little less, perhaps a little less wilderness oriented than I was. I'm not sure.
Well, that's a lot of equipment.
Plenty of equipment.
How long did you plan for this trip?
You know, the biggest planning was to find out where to go and where not to go. Because I was I started out in southeast Texas and traveled through 19 states and one Canadian province. Most of my travels were through areas I'd never been before. So I did a lot of talking to lots of local, regional, national level naturalists. Asked them about their favorite spots.
Yeah.
Where are the places that they would go if they had a spare day in the spring? One of the sort of secret reasons I did this trip was to spend 100 days with spring. And one of the sad stories of my life, there are not that many, luckily, is that I worked hard for my working life, and most springs I got out with nature and with birds no more than 2 or 3 days in a spring, which is criminal.
Yeah.
Instead, I was staring at a CRT, sending emails, receiving emails, writing reports, while the birds were migrating and while nature was doing its thing. So I said, gosh darn it, this time I'm going to see all of spring. And you could do that And you can make it as long as possible and stretch it out and really just revel in it.
That's great.
And that's what I did, and I, again, recommend that everyone do that in their own way. Maybe not in 100 days, but it can be done at least in some small way.
That's a great mission.
I'm a big spring person, although, all the other seasons are pretty fantastic too when it comes to nature.
You can cover the fall migration in the next book.
I'm planning to do that.
Oh, that'd be wonderful.
And, it would be a different kind of book. It wouldn't be a single sort of epic camp out. Instead, what I'm thinking of is focusing on a series of fall migratory spectacles, like the monarch butterflies.
Yes. Yeah.
I wouldn't follow them to Mexico, but I'd follow them to California. There are a number of wintering sites in California. The pronghorn, the elk. There are many, and there are a number of birds too. The migration of the raptors. There are a number of fantastic places where you can see 10,000 raptors in a day.
We'll have to have you back for that, and I'm sure some of our wildlife refuges could assist
absolutely.
with that.
Yeah, and on this trip, of course, I spent a lot of time in your wildlife refuges and working with and learning from your staff, which was fantastic.
Well, this looks like you spent a lot of time going up the Mississippi.
Oh, yes. There we are.
And I see our refuges there, Mingo.
There are quite a few, and this is just a partial. This is as many as I could fit on the on the graphic. But it gives you an idea of how many fantastic places. Every one of these red dots is a fantastic place that is very, very special in our natural history. And thank the Lord that we saved these places and that we're still working to protect them. And there are many, many more that are not as well known and just didn't fit on this slide. But you get an idea of the sort of transect that I took. It doesn't include the fact that once I got to the very top, up near Wendigo Lake, then I returned back. I was still chasing one of the last wood warblers that I wanted to see on its breeding habitat. That's the blackpoll warbler, which I was able to see up on high on a mountain in the Adirondacks of upstate New York. So that whole part of the story isn't on this map. But I started down in Texas, and I started at a Smithsonian project, a migratory bird center bird banding project at Mad Island, not an island at all, just a beautiful marshland on the coast of southeastern Texas near Corpus Christi. And spent some time with these guys, getting the hang of what they were doing. And they were basically at the front lines, waiting for the first groups of birds to come off the Gulf of Mexico and touch base right on the shore there in southern Texas. So the birds migrate, it's about an 800-mile crossing from the Yucatan. It takes them about anywhere from 15 to 18 hours. Ruby-throated hummingbirds do this as well as
Oh my God.
the birds that do this are fantastic. You'd think this would be beyond the call. They're doing that because it's apparently the most efficient thing to do. So they wait for a southerly wind that helps them get across the Gulf. But normally what happens when they see the first landfall, they drop into the bushes and rest and feed for that afternoon. And then once it gets dark, they head further north into sort of richer territory, up into the swamplands, into the deep south. And there are about 160 species of neotropical migrant songbirds, and Baltimore oriole is one of the classics of that. I saw plenty of Baltimore orioles. One of the wonderful birds we have nesting right here in northern Virginia. But it's not just Baltimore orioles. They're grosbeaks, they're warblers, they're buntings, they're all sorts of things. It's really one of the most fantastic groups of mobile birds that are, over the next 50 years, are going to either sink or swim because of what we are able to do to protect them and to know them well and provide the habitat and the protection that they're going to need.
Are these your photos?
Yes.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. I made my way up around the Horn, up into southernmost Louisiana. So that whole arc from southeastern Texas to southern Louisiana is where these migrant songbirds tend to first stop. And here at another bird banding site at a little patch of forest right on the coast at Grand Chenier State Wildlife Refuge. This project is run by the University of Southern Mississippi. And it was actually, this is the closest I got to being in New Guinea. Because
with the humidity
it was,
in that.
it was very damp. I was in rubber boots the whole time. It was ankle-high mud in this little patch of rainforest that was mainly live oaks, prickly ash, a bunch of other trees, and it really did have the feel of New Guinea. Mosquitoes, poisonous snakes, and lots of birds. It was fantastic.
You prepared yourself for many
and
decades.
I was happy as a pig in mud. Every day I went out there. The amazing thing was this patch was about maybe 6 acres. And so every bird within flying was in this patch of woods. And what you'd see, difficult to photograph, a flock of 50 indigo buntings and blue grosbeaks. I could only photograph 5 or 6 of them at a time, but there's a little grasslands next to the woods, and as I walked through the grass at the edge of the forest, these swarms of blue birds would come up out of the grass.
Beautiful.
Fantastic. And also in the upper right, we see a beautiful male summer tanager. I'd see 10 or 12 at a time flying along the edge of the woods. So, what I was able to recapture, the sort of highlight of the teal book, were these bird waves.
Yeah.
So if I go back up into the Appalachians today, I'm not going to see a lot, because those bird waves, sadly, are no longer there because the numbers are down. They're down by about 50%.
Wow.
But if you get into these little patches on the coast, you can basically go back in time and see what it was like and what teal saw. Now, of course, my objective in this book is to encourage us, our country, to bring back those bird waves.
Sure.
And hopefully I've done my small part to tell that story and to try to get us back on track. So from southern Louisiana, I headed up into central Louisiana. Well, actually, I headed over to northeastern Texas. This wonderful cypress swamp is in a place called Caddo Lake. And Caddo Lake is a great bass fishing. You'll be happy to know,
Yes.
Mark.
I
One of
should've gone
the
with you on that
finest
stretch.
bass fishing places in Texas, and so
like
it's
it.
famous for that. It's also stomping ground for Don Henley, the drummer for the
Really?
Eagles. He has his own nature conservation outfit called the Caddo Lake Institute.
Wow.
That he runs there, and he is actually working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Nature Conservancy to bring back the paddlefish to Caddo Lake.
Yes, yeah.
And they are working on a captive release program there with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and quite a remarkable thing. I saw no paddlefish.
Did you see Don Henley?
I didn't. I have seen Don Henley playing. I was on actually when I worked in the State Department, he was on a delegation I took to Brisbane, Australia.
Oh,
He was on
neat.
because he had his own institute interested in wetlands. He came with us to the Ramsar Convention in Brisbane, Australia, and served as one of our reps.
Oh, that's
one of the more
wonderful.
popular ones, as you might expect. Great. And Caddo Lake is also a place where there are lots of reports of Bigfoot. We didn't see any Bigfoot, but there were a lot of big birds and a lot of good birds. And this is Mia Brown, one of the staff of Caddo Lake State Park. I went out with her, take some groups out to get to know the birds out there. So she's doing her job for nature. Another wonderful group I met there at Caddo Lake National Wildlife Refuge was a group from North Texas State University, a Herp Group, a series of 10 students and a wonderful professor, Rich Kazmaier. And they were doing their annual herp survey, because this is one of the richest places in the United States for herps. Here's a hognose snake, a gorgeous little milk snake, the adorable cottonmouth. They don't even collect them because they're so common there. But they count them.
Yeah.
But I needed a cottonmouth. I love cottonmouths. I needed to photograph one. Green tree frog and many, many more, which I don't have time to show you today.
Yeah, beautiful.
Caddo Lake National Wildlife Refuge, that's a mouthful, is based in Karnak, Texas, which is Lady Bird Johnson's birthplace.
Hometown.
And that's where she grew up. And of course, Lady Bird is famous for the reflowering of our highways and reflowering of our roadsides. And this Coreopsis, I just show that in her honor, and I'm a big fan of Ladybird.
She's one of our heroes here. You know, we have those placards up. Ladybird is there.
The work that she did had a huge impact.
Extraordinary.
And she was an extraordinary person working under the most difficult circumstances.
Yes,
If you think of first ladies.
Yes.
It can
and
be.
it's totally appropriate she had a flower named after her because she loved flowers. That's great.
And from there, I went a little bit east over to West Feliciana Parish, where I found the Audubon House. This is, in fact, Oakley Plantation, where John James Audubon boarded for a short while as a teacher and amanuensis to a young woman. It didn't last very well. Apparently, she fell in love with him, and the parents decided he was too close for comfort, and they moved him on to a nearby plantation. But this is one of the most beautiful places in America. Not the plantation. The plantation itself is gorgeous, but this corner of the Mississippi, with a mix of upland and lowland and bottomland and swamp, is absolutely gorgeous. This is where Audubon painted more than 40 plates for his famous Birds of America
I think I recognize that picture in your book.
That's right. It's one of the few photographs in the book. And can't stop without sharing a photograph of the Mississippi, which down here in Louisiana is difficult to photograph. It's just way too big, and it's normally in flood, and it's in flood as it is right here. And here, this is an area in Bottomland, and we're seeing sorghum field that used to be prime habitat for ivory-billed woodpecker and other things, black bear, panther, and other things. In the back is the Tensas River bottomlands, and that's where the last of the ivory-bills lived. And the last of those that were, formally documented, that was in 1948, and I think it was the artist, not Al Gilbert. I can't remember who it was now, but this whole area was logged over, very sadly. Here's the Tensas. It's all come back, and now it's Tensas National Wildlife Refuge. And the people at Tensas, the experts there, have very studiously or assiduously reforested in all 16 dominant tree species there. So they're essentially creating restoration habitat for ivory-bill. Now we just need the white lab coat people to bring back the ivory-bill, which I honestly believe will happen. I'm not sure what decade it'll happen. Probably 2-3 decades, we might have something that looks like an ivory-bill in these woods. At least that's what I'm lobbying for.
Cool.
And I went out with one of the Fish and Wildlife staffers, Nathan Rennick, and he took me to some of the oldest growth stands, which are exactly date to 1948, or a little older. Some of the small trees weren't cut, but the Chicago Mill and Lumber Company, which owned this tract, cut every large tree except for one or two very large cypress that are in the water. And so these trees there's some old sort of medium growth trees that are big 60, 70 years old, but no older.
Yeah.
And that's a little bit heartbreaking. But when you see a prothonotary warbler, you feel a little bit better. I think there's no doubt about that. This is a bird that, of course, probably nests right along the Potomac here.
Yep.
And then you can get to some places. If you cross the border from Louisiana into Mississippi, you can go to Delta National Forest, a little north of Vicksburg, and you can go into the Sweetgum Special Preserve, which is 40 acres that has some of the oldest trees in the South. These are trees that did not get cut by Chicago Mill and Lumber. And this is a 500-year-old, 5-foot diameter sweetgum that, in my mind, undoubtedly hosted at some point in its life ivory-billed woodpeckers. And so for me, sort of counting coup on this tree and sort of paying homage to this tree, I felt I was sort of getting a little bit closer to the history of those ivory-billed woodpeckers, which is, of course, still one of my favorite birds.
Yeah.
Can't stop thinking about them. And when you're in Mississippi, you can't not think about the other aspects of Mississippi. It's home to 9,271 churches, everyone different, everyone spectacular and beautiful. I can unfortunately only have time to show you one today. And also, just amazing little towns in the deep south, towns that maybe had their heyday 50, 100, 150 years ago. This is Nitta, Yuma, Mississippi. I love that name, Nitta, Yuma. I assume that's an Indian, Native American name. And you can see the Nitta, Yuma fire truck there.
Yeah.
Here's the big house, presumably the plantation that ran Nitta, Yuma. Still looking pretty nice. And as we go north, we cross the border into Arkansas, southern Arkansas, which is also, deep south. Some people forget that Arkansas is deep south. And when you go into St. Charles, here we are at the corner of Broad and Main.
Yeah.
And it's like going back in time. And I really got a kick out of spending time in these towns. Of course, the hospitality you find in places like this, if you can find a person,
Yeah.
they're not as populous as they used to be, but the people there are just as nice and just as hospitable as they ever were. And this is in Crossset, Arkansas, where I'm at the local annual Waterways Festival, where all the local organizations that use water and that conserve water. Fish and Wildlife Service was there from Felsenthal National Wildlife Refuge. And I had my own little desk on bird migration, teaching 4th grade students. And as you can see, I love big trees. And I'm here, we're moving a little further north. We're at the very top of the Mississippi Delta. That's in southernmost Illinois. Okay. Not everyone realizes that there's some Delta country in Illinois. This is deep South Illinois, and it's really fantastic country. And this is a fantastic champion cherry bark oak with a fantastic naturalist next to a gentleman named Mark Gooterslow, a wonderful fellow. He has his own mission, which is to save the Catch River watershed, which flows into the Ohio and then into the Mississippi. It's an absolute magnificent. Audubon wrote about this area where he saw large flocks of passenger pigeons and ivory-billed woodpeckers. So ivory-bills got this far north into Illinois, which is really quite remarkable. And here we are on the very border, teetering on the border of north and south. This is where on the left, the Missouri, and on the right, the Mississippi come together in St. Louis. There's actually a park that marks that, and you can actually stand at that. I just stumbled on it. I didn't even know, but it was fantastic, and also very good birding there. So here we're in the Northlands, where you can see now we're getting to bobolink country, up into very, very rich, very, very tidy Illinois agricultural lands along the Mississippi. If you stay close to the Mississippi flow, you have wonderful green spaces. And here we are at Wyalusing State Park in southeastern Wisconsin. Or is that southwestern? That's southwestern.
Southwestern, yeah.
Southwestern Wisconsin is one of the finest state parks I've ever been in, and it was filled with birds. And the overlooks, looking over the Mississippi and over into Iowa, quite fantastic. Also, all the Indian mounds. There were more than 50 Indian mounds in Wyalusing itself, and these are these effigy mounds that feature bears or snakes or birds, falcons. All sorts of things. And just across the river is Effigy Mounds National Monument, which has about 100 of these wonderful effigy mounds featured.
They're amazing. I mean, my daughter goes to school in southern Wisconsin, and the campus has Indian mounds on it. Still over in
There
Beloit.
were tens of thousands of these effigy mounds
They're
created.
everywhere.
It's fantastic. Sadly, of course, subsequent to our colonization, most of them have been plowed under, gotten out of the way. But luckily, some of the most fantastic ones are still present, so people can see them and just marvel at these
It was a nice
earthworks.
part of your book, too. I learned quite a bit about them.
Well, I saw my first one down in Mississippi, down near the Tensas, and I was just, struck that we just forget so quickly.
They were your companion along the flyway.
Exactly. And these birds were my companions as well. Here's a cerulean warbler, which is one of the sort of iconic migratory warblers that's not doing terribly well and that a lot of us are thinking about, and a lot of action is being taken. There's been a lot of forest management that's taking place right now to create ideal forest conditions for the wonderful cerulean warbler. This little guy would come down to my campsite right there at Wyalusing and sing. It was about 38 degrees. You can see him all puffed up. Cold as the dickens. I was wearing 2 hats and 2 pair of gloves. But he was in full spring mode. And moving further up into northwestern Wisconsin, we're here now in Creeks Meadows, a wonderful state wildlife area that used to be a large Pleistocene lake that became a swamp, which became a carpet factory, and then back to a wildlife reserve. And it's gigantic. It has wolves. It has all sorts of wildlife, and it's a great place for bird watching. And I spent 3 glorious spring mornings there with sandhill cranes and woodcocks and golden-winged warblers. It was really just quite something. This was one of those places I didn't know anything about. A young birder I bumped into at Wyalusing said, "Hey, don't forget to go to Creeks Meadows if you head north." He said, "I'm headed there next." He was headed back to North Dakota, and he stopped there too. And what a tip it was, a fantastic place. So one of the things that I had to do was sort of move at the speed of nature. So here I am up in northeastern Minnesota at Gooseberry Falls State Park, right on, basically on the edge of north side of Lake Superior. These are trembling aspens, and they are barely leafing out. And this is actually the 31st of May. And so on this day, I got message that one of the sites I was headed to in Canada had just gotten 12 inches of snow. So I had to slow down a little bit. My wife came out and visited. She hadn't seen me for 6 weeks. And she came out for a visit. We camped out, and we did a lot of bird watching here and there, and waited for spring to catch up to us. And another one of the sort of bittersweet things, I took her out to this beautiful patch of boreal forest, and she kept asking me what these birds were singing. She'd point, "What's that bird there?" And I said, "I can't hear it." And she said, "What's that bird there?" And I said, "I can't hear it." She just shook her head. And what I had forgotten to do before I did this trip was to get a pair of hearing aids, which I now have, and now can actually hear those birds. But I couldn't identify them for her then. A little bit sad.
But you raised an interesting point with the snow. Do the birds ever get caught migrating and have to go back south?
Yeah, so I visited with a couple, one of the local experts in Duluth, and they told me the story of a reverse migration. When, again, it was around the 31st of May, it was 2 years earlier in 2013, when there was a big push from the southwest up the Mississippi, songbirds coming north, and then they ran into a huge northeaster, or just a north blow, and the birds, basically tens of thousands of birds, had to turn around and migrate south to escape from this freezing cold and sleet. And I'm sure many of the birds died. But the people in Duluth were just deluged with birds. They fell into the backyard. They fell into all the shore around Lake Superior. It's quite a fantastic and horrifying thing.
Yeah.
Birds all over the lake shore.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's what we call a true fallout.
Yes, definitely.
Not something you really wish for the birds.
No.
But quite something to see. Yeah.
And now we're still in Minnesota here.
Well, here we are, finally made it to the very top of the Mississippi after the winding way, 2,552 miles. It ends at Lake Itasca, and it starts at that little rock crossing there, not a very prepossessing, there's no waterfall, there's no grand thing. And we walked up there. I walked up there with a friend, a former Fish and Wildlife staffer, who's now retired to Minnesota, Marshall Howe. And we were up there with a group of, just sort of normal tourists. And, they'd shuffle up, look at that, look at the sign, and turn around and shuffle back.
Yeah, I know.
Because the Mississippi in a little bit sort of ends with a little bit with a whimper.
It does.
Because you expect something. I'm not sure what to expect, because most people aren't thinking about, but that's it.
I know.
And of course, most people think of that as the end, and I sort of thought of it as the beginning, because the beginning of the sort of adventure. From there, I was going to head across the border into Canada, into Quebec, and drive as far north as I could, and camp up in the Great North Woods.
Yeah.
And and see what I'd find. Because if you look at a field guide to the birds of North America, and if you sort of go into the warbler section and look at those range maps, the sort of heartland of that range maps, all of them feature northern Ontario as sort of the center of their range. A lot of these ranges go from Maine, northwestward, all the way to Alaska. And right in the middle is northern Quebec. So I said, if I go there, I'll be at the sort of center for all these wonderful warblers. And so I did go there. And I found out somewhat otherwise, actually.
I bet you did.
It's a glorious, beautiful spot. And if you're a walleye fisherman, or if you're a northern pike fisherman, you're in great shape.
We used to go up there and do that, but we
You're
didn't see many birds.
absolutely in great shape. There are so many lakes, and there's some nice rivers, and there's some nice campgrounds. But it's basically, if you're up there at the end of early June, mid-June, you're basically up there with the black flies and the mosquitoes and one or two fishermen. And what I was surprised at was that it was very, very impoverished. And what I found as this heartland what I thought was the heartland was not the heartland, because a lot of it is jack pine barren. There's basically no soil, it's just sand. Remember, not so long ago there was a mile of glacier lying there. It left a lot of rock and sand, and there's not a lot of nutrients in that gravel and sand, and it's also an area that suffers some dry seasons. So as a result, you get fire. Then where you get forest fire, you get jack pine in the north. Jack pine is the fire-loving northern boreal conifer, and I am not a fan of jack pine. Now we all know
I'm sensing that.
we all know the jack pine is important for Kirtland's warbler. And that's in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula. The Kirtland's warbler has its main nesting territory, and they nest only in these little tiny jack pines. But you go 300 miles north, and you get tens of millions of acres of jack pine, and yet there are no Kirtland's warblers. And there's not much else, actually. You get ruby-crowned kinglets, you get gray jays, you get ravens, you get some boreal chickadees, and you get some Tennessee warblers, but the big swarm of warblers, they weren't there. So what I found was that I had to go to special patches. Well, first of all, what we find is this is the land that belongs to the First Nations. This is Native American country. This is Martin Kanate, an Ojibwe Cree, and he takes care of the road that I was driving on. And so he considers this his land. The Canadian government consider it their land. So there's a small disagreement there, and I'm not going to get involved in that. In some of the clearings, you do see wonderful wildflowers like these slipper orchids that, of course, we can see right here in the woods. And there are, if you get into the beautiful conifers in the white spruce and in the bogs that have the tamaracks and the spruce and the balsam fir, you get the wonderful singing Swainson's thrushes. Here are the birds that are mainly in the jack pine, but also, of course, they like the boreal bogs as well. There's a gray jay and the two kinglets and the boreal chickadee. And then you get some northern things, the northern breeders that are kind of special because we don't see them breeding down here, Bonaparte gull and the greater yellowlegs, and big surprise, white pelicans. I think of white pelicans as Yellowstone, not northern Ontario, but there they were. And you do get a spruce grouse, not many, but they're only in the spruce. Well, actually, they do like the jack pine a little bit too, but they're called a fool hen because they let you get really close to them. And I saw lots of evidence that the local, the First Nations people were harvesting them for dinner. And yes, they were. They are edible. And there were some mammals. I saw the occasional moose. I saw 8 or 9 black bears. I saw some wolves, but not very many. It really was thin on the ground. And, I thought about this a lot, and I talked to some people after the trip, and I think basically the story is this. It's a story of geography. The wintering grounds for these birds is relatively limited. Northern South America, Southern Central America, and the Caribbean. If you actually total up all those hectares of wooded habitat and then compare it to the total number of hectares of wooded habitat that encompasses the Great North Wood, it's about 10 to 1.
Yeah.
So there's too much habitat up north, and there's not enough habitat down south. So basically, even with great breeding success up north, at the end of the long winter, remember these birds are spending 7 months down south. The only ones that survive, that have a patch of habitat down south that go back, are the ones that can survive in that small patch of habitat down south. So that's my informal guess. It's not a scientific paper that proves this, but I'm thinking that that's probably what it is.
Well, Bruce, you've taken us on a huge journey here. Let me ask you a couple questions
Sure.
that come out of this. What are some of the conservation challenges for bird migration today? Because we read a lot about it.
Yeah, you bet. Unfortunately, they're more than there used to be. So, cell phones produce cell towers. TV and cable, those produce, satellite TV, more towers.
Mm-hmm.
Lit towers attract migrating birds at night.
Yeah.
The migrating birds strike the towers and get stunned or killed. Lighted buildings in cities attract birds, and birds fly into the windows, stunned or killed. Wind farms, the wonderful wind farms. Where are they put? They're put where there's wind, often on tops of high ridges, which are also the areas that catch the wind that are good for migration. Mortality for migratory birds as well as migratory bats. So a lot of the sort of human artifacts are posing threats. The cats that we love and care for, if we let them go out, they're natural hunters. They're hunting birds. They're hunting birds. They're hunting mammals. They're killing chipmunks. They're killing little voles. They're killing machines. They're glorious killing machines. We know. Pete Mara's written about that in his book. There's a lot out there that is sort of disturbing the sort of natural process of migration that's related to human dominance of the environment. So those are things, that we have to think about. And what we need to do, of course, is create protected spaces without those towers, spaces without those buildings, green spaces where they can find water, shelter, and food. And those are the national wildlife refuges. Those are the state parks. Those are the county parks. Those are the greenways. Those are the little swamps that nobody even thinks about.
Right.
They're there, and we need to, protect more. Ed Wilson has written about our half, protecting half for humankind, half for nature. Yeah. That's the least we can do. We're only one species of millions.
Right, we still get half the planet.
Come on, man.
Under Ed's system.
Yeah.
The other underlying big question that all the readers are going to have, and you do address in here, is I'm guessing you navigated with some type of GIS system, map question.
I did.
How did our little warblers navigate? What do we know? I mean, I know it's a black box.
First of all, what can they do? They can, a Tennessee warbler can go from its tropical woodland patch, its little patch of an acre or so, less than an acre, where it spends the winter. It goes from that patch all the way across, up through Central America, across the Gulf of Mexico, up the Mississippi, into Ontario, and it finds that patch of woods where it was born. That's, again, a patch of an acre or so. Yeah. It goes back there. If that patch is still being occupied by its parents, then it moves around the edge. If its parents aren't there, it'll probably take over the same patch where it was born. How does it do that? And that's the question you're asking that I don't have a perfect answer to.
Do we have any?
They are remarkable. They are a compass. Birds have magnetite in their head, in their brain, so they can apparently use that to tell north and south. They use that ability to actually read the magnetic compass lines of the Earth. They can actually, songbirds are able at night, remember these birds are migrating at night.
Right.
They're able to actually develop a star map and to identify the North Star, and thereby use a way of another sort of redundant way of telling north and south. They can hear ultrasound and infrasound that's like elephants. They can hear these sounds. They can hear the sounds of the mountain ranges, of rivers. And thereby, a lot of it is based, there's movements are perfected over their 3 or 4 trips back and forth. These birds don't live a long time, so they don't do it very many times. I think the successful ones might do it as many as 10 times. Knowledge they actually can remember, hearing, just like we have knowledge when we're driving. We have all sorts of cues that we're not even paying attention to. They have those as well. They can detect the plane of polarized light. So they watch the sun, move through the sky, and they also watch the declination of the sun, and they also are able to, even after the sun has gone down, they can see polarized light up in the sky. This is another thing that we can't do.
No.
There are a lot of cues that they have that we don't. We still, so I think what we do know is they can orient very well, and they can follow a course. Like the migrating Swainson's thrush that's been well studied, follows actually the same course all the way across North America. It follows the same compass course. And then when it gets up to the proper latitude, it starts moving east-west. Okay. Now it's that the compass course, we understand the east-west part at the top, how it actually finds that bush where it was born. We don't still know how it does that.
Maybe it's good to have some mysteries.
Well, maybe.
One last question.
Sure.
I mean, I can't imagine anybody reading your book wouldn't want to go see the spring migration themselves. Maybe not do the whole journey.
You bet.
And you live here in the Mid-Atlantic, and a lot of the people at the talk tonight would live in the Mid-Atlantic.
Sure.
Are there some good places here in the Mid-Atlantic to witness spring migration?
Absolutely, and there are different kinds. The songbird one, what you want to do is to get into a patch of oak woods in late May. Well, sorry, I'd say between the 10th and 15th of May is the height of the songbird migration. So what you want to do is get into the woods on a day, and ideally with someone who knows the bird song.
Yeah.
Good to go out with like Audubon Natural Society or the Maryland Audubon Society or the Maryland Ornithological Society. Go out on a bird walk. They'll know where to go. The ideal time is to go after a couple of days of a southwest wind. That brings lots of birds up into our area. And you'll see amazing things. On the non-songbird side, a lot of people like to go see the red knots down on the shore, and that means going to Bombay Hook National Wildlife Refuge on Delaware Bay or Little Creek. There are a series of places all the way down to Cape Henlopen on the west side of Delaware Bay, on the eastern edge of Delaware. Is also a wonderful phenomenon when you've got lots of these water birds migrating as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Bruce. This was a wonderful discussion, and very much appreciate your time. And I'd like to remind folks, your newest book, which chronicles songbird migration, is North on the Wing, Travels with the Songbird Migration of Spring. It's a great read, utterly enjoyable, and it inspired me to get out in May. Thank God I got a little time.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Bruce.
Thank
Much
you.
appreciated. And thank you for tuning in.